Welcome to this special history episode of French Connections Plus.
In this show, we're going to turn the spotlight on what has come to be seen as a dark period. The Middle Ages, le Moyen Age in French.
The Middle Ages covered 1,000 years, centuries full of political upheaval, royal intrigue, war, disease, and famine.
But it was also a rich period of creative and intellectual development when France in many ways took on the shape we know today.
Join us as we time travel back to le Moyen Age.
If you look carefully, there are traces of the Middle Ages across Paris. After all, it is a period that lasted some 10 centuries.
Now, when exactly the Middle Ages began is up for debate, but most historians seem to agree that the Moyen Age started with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476.
As for the end of what's sometimes been called the Dark Ages, it's either the fall of Constantinople in 1453 or Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492.
And that ushered in a new era known as the Renaissance.
Medieval historians tend to roll their eyes when people generalize about the Middle Ages as a unified block because, well, 1,000 years, a millennium, it's a long time.
Now, we only have a limited amount of time on our show, so if you need a refresher, here's a recap of the Middle Ages in France.
It's hard to summarize 1,000 years. So historians tend to break down the Middle Ages into three periods: the early, high, and late Middle Ages. In collective memory, it was a time of knights in shining armor, castles and dungeons, warring kingdoms, and the growing dominance of the Catholic Church. But aside from the somewhat romantic fantasy, people tend to view the Middle Ages mostly in a negative light, associating it with violence, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, poverty, a lack of hygiene, and sickness. The Black Plague, for instance, wiped out an estimated 1/3 of the population of Europe after it first appeared in the late 1340s. In France, le Moyen Âge was sculpted by the names of King Clovis, Charlemagne, Philippe Auguste, and Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, who all contributed to many legendary political breakthroughs. In fact, France only became a unified nation during the Middle Ages, and Paris, its capital. The city really came into its own during the Moyen Âge, seeing rapid commercial and urban development. By 1550, it was the largest and most populated city in the West, with already many architectural wonders.
In Paris, the biggest symbol of the Moyen Âge is Notre Cathedral, located smack dab in the center of the capital on l'Île de la Cité.
Notre Dame is the most famous medieval building in France. Construction began in 1163, and it took almost 200 years to complete.
Notre Dame is considered one of the finest examples of French Gothic architecture, with its pioneering use of flying buttresses and its enormous and colorful rose windows.
Throughout the centuries, it's been the real heart and soul of the capital, even though it was partly destroyed during the French Revolution and almost completely burned down in 2019.
Up until the fire, it was the most visited monument in France, and reconstruction is underway to bring it back to its former glory.
There are many examples of medieval architecture in Paris, like the beautiful Collège des Bernardins where we are now. This historic monument was home to monks for 5 centuries, up until the French Revolution.
These days, it's a cultural center for researchers and students with workshops open to the public. It's the perfect place to meet a medieval historian. Julie Pilanger, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So the Middle Ages can sometimes have a negative connotation. We say people are stuck in the Dark Ages. Why does it have such a bad rap?
In fact, it's linked to the Renaissance, which follow the Middle Ages. So Renaissance is the revival of the antiquity, Roman and Greek antiquity. The Renaissance is also synonym of enlightenment. So everything is between this, the intricity and this alignment is, of course, middle and minus.
So what are some of the cliches of these dark ages?
War, a lot of violence, sexual abuse, like a weak monarchy, peasant who are like very poor and, compared to, the time of beauty and luxury of Renaissance. But in fact, the reality is very different. This 10th century, which are named or labeled as Middle Ages, are in fact very different. The early Middle Ages are very different from the end of Middle Ages. In fact, right now, scholars tend to distinguish like 3 Middle Ages, like 1, 2, 3, and the middle of the Middle Ages, like the central Middle Ages, framed the idea of Dark Middle Ages, because this is the feudal society when the monarchy is weak.
So in the collective memory, when we think about the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, they seem kind of dirty and full of disease, but hygiene wasn't actually as bad as sometimes we think it was.
We know, for example, that Philip August, who was a very important monarch in the Middle Ages, one of his important measures for Paris, which was at the time one of the most important cities of European, he decided to that Paris stinked. He thought Paris stinked, so he built a sewer for the city. It was the first time, and then it expanded to the rest of France and European cities.
So one of the misconceptions is that things were very bad for women during the Middle Ages. Was that the case?
No, not at all. Renaissance was not a very good period for women. In fact, for some scholars, there was a golden ages for women after the Black Plague, because the ravages of the Black Plague and a lot of death led to a lack of workers and an increase for the wages, and women get a place in this situation, in this context.
What's been the most exciting recent discovery about the Middle Ages?
For my field, for example, for women history, we discovered bra and
bras in the Middle Ages.
In the Middle Ages. For a long time, we thought that there is no undergarment in the Middle Ages, but it seemed to be like the contrary. And, well, kind of an anecdote, but, the myth of chastity...
chastity belt.
Chastity belt, it's an example of the phantasm about Middle Ages, because there is no proof of such a thing in the Middle Ages.
So no chastity belts, but bras, okay. So other than bras and Notre Dame, what does France owe to the Middle Ages?
I think just the basis of established government with the administration. In fact, the monarch of the end of Middle Ages in Germany, England, or France really built a modern state with an organized administration, with mass armies, and also increase the taxation to build the state. So I think they really put the basis of a modern government, which is in place today. There is a lot of similarities, in fact, in this way.
Pop culture tends to portray the Middle Ages as a period of limited intellectual and creative advances, especially compared to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. But it was actually a period of bubbling creativity.
France's first university, for example, was created around the end of the 12th century, taking root here on the left bank of the Seine.
The neighborhood came to be known as the Latin Quarter because Latin was the language of instruction.
And the university was eventually known as La Sorbonne, after one of its many colleges, quickly gaining a reputation across Europe and making Paris a great intellectual center of the Middle Ages.
Meanwhile, art during the Middle Ages centered around religion. Here in Paris, the National Collection of Medieval Art is housed in the Hôtel de Cluny, a stone's throw from La Sorbonne.
Located in the heart of the Latin Quarter, the Musée de Cluny is a voyage through time and space. The museum itself is built within two historic monuments: a medieval mansion once belonging to the Cluny Abbey, itself built up against ruins of Gallo-Roman baths dating back to the 2nd century. Home to some 24,000 pieces, the recently refurbished museum has one of the biggest collections of medieval art. You can witness 1,000 years of creation, far from the clichés of the Dark Ages.
L'art du Moyen Âge, un art de la couleur, un art qui brille, un art qui est dédié à l'Église et un art qui raconte l'histoire de la religion, effectivement.
Perhaps the most prized treasure of the museum is La Dame à la licorne, a series of 6 tapestries. 5 of them depict the 5 senses: taste, hearing, sight, smell, and touch. As for the 6th tapestry, which displays the words "À mon seul désir," to my only desire, its meaning was a mystery for many years. It's come to be interpreted as representing love and understanding.
Cette tapisserie est unique, c'est la Joconde du musée de Cluny. Elle représente des figures qui sont un peu mythiques, comme le lion, comme la licorne. Et la licorne, elle est ambiguë. La licorne, si on est dans un contexte religieux, c'est la chasteté, c'est la blancheur, la chasteté. Si on est dans un contexte profane, eh bien c'est l'amour, c'est le sensuel.
On top of tapestries, the museum features sculptures, fine enamel, stained glass windows, and even medieval board games. There's also an impressive collection of floating heads, with a fascinating history. Back in the day, statues of the kings of Judah adorned the facade of Notre Dame Cathedral. Even though they represented biblical figures, they were beheaded during the French Revolution of 1789 as symbols of monarchy. They were lost to the world until they were discovered by accident almost 200 years later. It's thanks to sculptures like these that Paris became a reference for art and culture during the Middle Ages.
Well, that wraps it up for this special episode on the Middle Ages in France.
And a big thank you to Louise Morer for helping us coordinate this show. Is there a chapter of French history you'd like to know more about? Well, be sure to let us know.
You can always tweet at Villeminot or reach out on social media.
And we'll see you soon for another episode of French Connections Plus.